Look down at your hands. Go ahead.
They look clean. They probably are. You wash them today without thinking about it. It's the most ordinary thing a person does. But there was a time, not so long ago, when washing your hands before touching a patient was considered an insult. Not unnecessary. An insult. An accusation against the honor of a gentleman. Here's what they left out of the story. In a hospital in Vienna, women were dying by the hundreds. Young mothers, hours after giving birth, burning with fever, gone within days. And one doctor figured out exactly why. He was right. He proved it. The deaths stopped. And for that, the medical profession destroyed him. Stay with me. Because this isn't really a story about a hospital in 1847. It's a story about something inside your own head. Something that is running right now as you watch this. By the end, you'll know its name, and you won't be able to unsee it. The Vienna General Hospital, one of the finest in the world. Its maternity service was split in two. The first clinic was run by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was run by midwives. Same building, same beds, same women, sorted between the two almost at random, day by day. But the two clinics were not the same. In one of them, you were far more likely to die. The first clinic, the one run by the trained doctors, the men of science, killed its mothers at a rate that reached, in its worst month, nearly 1 in 5. 18%. The midwives' clinic next door, around 2. The women knew. Of course they knew. They talked to each other. And when a woman in labor realized she was being taken to the first clinic, the doctor's clinic, she would drop to her knees and beg to be sent to the midwives instead. Some of them, when they could, simply gave birth in the street on the way to the hospital, and then walked in afterward. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. The women who delivered in the street had a better chance of surviving than the ones who made it to a clean bed under the care of an educated physician. Something in that building was killing them. Everyone could see the numbers. Nobody could see the cause. Into this walks a young Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis. He is 28. He is put in charge of the first clinic, the killing one. And unlike everyone before him, he refuses to accept that these deaths are just fate. He wants the number. He wants the reason. For months, Semmelweis hunts, and every theory fails him. Is it the air? The overcrowding? He checks. The deadly clinic isn't more crowded. Is it something about the women themselves? No. They're sorted almost at random. Is it fear? There was a priest who walked through the ward, ringing a bell for the dying. Semmelweis thought the sound might be terrifying the women into fever, so he had the priest change his route. Silenced the bell. Nothing. The women kept dying. If this sounds impossible, it gets worse. Because the answer, when it came, did not come from the ward. It came from a corpse. In 1847, Semmelweis's close friend, a professor named Jakob Kolečka, was performing an autopsy. A student's knife slipped and cut his finger. A small wound. Nothing by the standards of the day. Within days, Kolečka was dead. And when Semmelweis read the report of what had killed his friend, his blood ran cold. Because the damage inside Kolečka's body was identical to what he had seen over and over inside the young mothers. The same disease. A man cut in an autopsy room, and a woman who had just given birth, dying the same death. And Semmelweis understood. The doctors of the first clinic began their mornings in the autopsy room, dissecting the dead, including the women who had died the day before. Then, with those same hands, barely rinsed, They walked upstairs and reached inside living mothers to examine them. They were carrying something invisible. Semmelweis called it cadaverous particles, particles of death clinging to the hand. He didn't have the word for it. This was decades before anyone had proven that germs even existed. He couldn't see it, he couldn't name it, but he could stop it. In May 1847, he gave one order. Before you touch a patient, wash your hands. Not with water, with a solution of chlorinated lime until the smell of the dead was gone from your skin. Pause here for a second. One word in the comments. Chlorine. It'll make sense by the end. And then something happened that should have ended the argument forever. The dying stopped. The mortality rate in his clinic fell from 18% to 2 to 1. In the worst ward in the hospital, mothers stopped dying. Not a theory, not a hope. A number on a page, month after month, falling and staying down. He had done it. He had reached into the machinery of death and switched it off. He had the proof in his hands. And they hated him for it. You would think a man who cut maternal deaths by 90% would be carried through the streets. Instead, his career began to die. Because understand what Semmelweis's discovery actually said. It said, the doctors are the ones killing the mothers. The respected physician, with his education and his honor, his own unwashed hands were the murder weapon. He had been carrying death from the dead into the living for his entire career, and never known it. No one wanted to hear that, especially not the men who would have to look at their own hands and count. Here's what they left out. They didn't reject Semmelweis because his evidence was weak. His evidence was overwhelming. They rejected him because his evidence was an insult. Because being right meant they had been, unknowingly, for years, killing the very people they had sworn to save. And there was a second problem. Semmelweis could show that it worked. He could not explain why. The idea of an invisible particle of death was, to the science of 1847, a superstition. The reigning theory said disease came from bad air. Semmelweis had proof without a mechanism, and the establishment does not trust proof it cannot explain. His own boss, a conservative man named Johann Klein, refused to renew his position. In 1849, Semmelweis was pushed out of the clinic he had saved. He was not entirely alone. A handful of Vienna's finest, Skoda, Rokitansky, Hebra, saw what he had done and defended him. Remember that. It matters for how this ends. But they were not enough. So he went home. Back to Budapest, to a hospital where mothers were still dying at the old, terrible rates. And he did the only thing he knew how to do. He gave the order again. Wash your hands. And once again, the dying stopped. He had now proven the same thing twice. 2 cities, years apart, hundreds of lives. And once again, the wider profession looked at the result and looked away. In 1861, he poured all of it into a book. Every table, every death, every argument. The reviews that came back were cold or cruel or silent. He had written the most important obstetrics book of the century, and it changed almost nothing. Imagine that. You solve it, you prove it, you write it all down, and the world simply declines to read. The last years are hard to watch. His mind began to go. The records are not clear on why, and we should be careful here. The accounts disagree. In 1865, his colleagues committed him to an asylum. When he arrived, He seems to have realized what was happening and tried to leave. The guards beat him. They forced him into a straitjacket and locked him in a darkened cell. 2 weeks later, on the 13th of August, 1865, Ignaz Semmelweis was dead. He was 47. The cause of death was sepsis, blood poisoning, from an infected wound, most likely one he received in that beating. Sit with that. The man who discovered that unclean hands carried death into the body died of exactly that. The one disease he had spent his life fighting reached into him and finished what the profession started. He died of the thing he tried to warn you about. And almost no one, at his funeral, understood the irony. So was he wrong? Within 20 years, Louis Pasteur proved that germs are real. Joseph Lister built surgery around killing them. And every single thing Semmelweis had claimed, with no microscope, no theory, nothing but a stack of numbers and a dead friend, turned out to be true. The invisible particles had a name now. He had been right the whole time. Notice what saved him in the end. It was not the establishment admitting its mistake. It was science itself. Slow, grinding, self-correcting, finally catching up to a man who had run ahead of it and been punished for it. The system that broke him is the same system that, eventually, proved him. It just took longer than his life. There's a phrase for what happened to Semmelweis. Scientists use it today. They call it the Semmelweis reflex. The reflex to reject new evidence, instantly. Not because it is wrong, but because it contradicts what you already believe. The more the evidence insults you, the harder the reflex fires. And here's the part that should keep you up tonight. That reflex is not a flaw in 19th century doctors. It is standard equipment in the human mind. It's in yours, right now. There is something, some fact, some finding, some number sitting in plain sight that you are dismissing. This year, not because it's false, but because believing it would cost you something, would insult something you're sure of. So the question isn't whether Semmelweis was right. He was. The question is quieter and worse. What are you laughing at today that will be obvious in 100 years? You washed your hands this morning without a thought. A man died in a padded cell to make that reflex ordinary. Everything that is obvious was once an insult. This is Codex Origin. Stay strange. Send this to someone who trusts the experts a little too much, and to someone who doesn't trust them at all. They both need it.